Okay, so we're going to talk about one of the most beloved poets in modern Chinese literature, a writer famous for poems that are just filled with sunlight and joy. The thing is, his own life ended in darkness and tragedy when he was just 24 years old. This is the story of that incredible paradox, the profound and honestly heartbreaking life of the poet Yang Huang. So picture this. It's 1954. We're in Taipei. There's this young man, barely 24, who's already a huge rising star in the literary world. I mean, he is right at the peak of what looked like a brilliant, limitless career. And then, just like that, on a rainy Sunday morning, it was all over. His friend, the poet Yang Yi, described this absolutely horrific scene. He said, "The merciless wheels had rolled over both his legs. He was dead, his condition most tragic. A brilliant light just extinguished." But here's the thing. The real mystery isn't just how he died. It's the massive disconnect between the darkness of his death and the incredible light of what he created. And that brings us to the first part of his story, what we're calling the poet of sunlight. This is really where the paradox starts to take shape. Because the man who met this unbelievably violent end, he's celebrated for writing some of the most whimsical, joyful poetry you can possibly imagine. I mean, just listen to the titles of his most famous poems. The Fruit's Evening Party, Little Aunts, Summer Night. It's just so innocent. These aren't just poems, they're staples in school textbooks, things that generations of kids have recited. They create these worlds of pure, bright, joyful innocence. So how do you square that circle? How do you reconcile this dark life with such sunny art? Well, for a long, long time, the go-to explanation has been this, that his sunny children's poetry was basically a compensation for his own really bitter childhood. The theory is he was writing the happy childhood that he never got to have. And that's a really compelling idea, right? But is it the whole story? To even begin to unpack that theory, we have to go all the way back to the beginning, to what scholars call a childhood in tears. And this was the stark, brutal reality of his early years. He was born Yang Sen back in 1930 on a place called Chrysanthemum Island in China. And really, the tragedy started almost immediately. His mother died before he was even a year old, leaving him in a world completely without a mother's love. And this was the foundation of all his sorrow. He was raised by a neglectful, alcoholic father, and his life got even worse after his loving grandparents died. A cruel stepmother came into the picture, and she subjected him to constant neglect and just brutal beatings. You can imagine what that does to a kid. This profound isolation made him incredibly shy and deeply withdrawn. He didn't really need a biographer to spell out the pain for him. He did it himself, in just a few absolutely devastating words. He described his own youth as being spent growing up in crying. Just think about that for a second. Not just crying sometimes, but growing up in it, like it was the very air he had to breathe. Now, as if all of that personal tragedy wasn't enough, it was all playing out against this much larger backdrop of historical chaos. And that leads us to the next chapter of his story, A Life Adrift. His life was just completely swept up by history. In 1947, with the Chinese Civil War raging, his father dies, and he has to flee. A year later, in 48, he's somehow working as a newspaper editor in Qingdao. And then, just 1 year after that, his entire world changes again. The nationalist government retreats, and young Wan, who's a soldier by this point, finds himself on a ship headed to a totally new, unfamiliar land, Taiwan. And it's here, in this new place, as a young sergeant in the army, that he kind of finds his calling. He gets put in charge of a weekly wall newspaper, one of those things they post for everyone to read, and he's doing everything himself, writing, editing, printing, the whole shebang. And it's here, in September 1949, that he publishes his very first poem for children. Out of all that chaos of war and exile, this new, beautiful voice was born. Okay, so up to this point, that compensation theory seems to fit pretty perfectly, right? Sad boy grows up, finds his voice, and creates a happy world on paper. But the story is so much more complex and, frankly, a lot darker than that. And it means we have to start reading between the lines. And this gets us to the really crucial question. Is compensation the full story? What if those sunny poems weren't an escape from the darkness at all? What if they were actually a kind of mask for a darkness that never, ever left him? So let's look at the two different views of Yang Huang. The simple story says he wrote happy poems to escape a sad past. But the critical view, the one based on his private life, tells a much, much darker story. Friends eventually came to believe his death was actually a suicide. His private letters show a deep, ongoing depression. And maybe most chilling of all, right before he died, he reportedly burned his own manuscripts and personal photos. In this quote from one of his last letters, it just lays bare the depth of his despair. He wrote, "I am tired of everything. Hereafter, I will never dare to pick up a pen again to atone for my past sins." I mean, those are not the words of a man who's finding comfort in his art. They're the words of a man who feels like his life, and maybe even his work, has completely failed him. So we're left with this tragic life and this incredibly complicated inner world. But what about the work itself? What actually rose from all that tragedy? And that brings us to our final section, Art from Ashes. Despite his incredibly short life and all his personal demons, his legacy is just immense. The 20 or so children's poems he left behind, they became the gold standard, the model for Taiwanese children's poetry for more than 50 years. Poems like Summer Night are still staples in school textbooks. And there's even a prestigious literary prize, the Yanghwan Children's Poetry Award, created just to honor his name. He didn't just write a few poems, he literally built a foundation for others. When you look at the whole picture, his life wasn't really about escaping suffering. It was about creating in spite of it. He was standing in the darkest of places and somehow managed to project pure sunlight onto the page. His legacy is really a testament to that incredible ability to create moments of pure beauty, even when you're facing overwhelming pain. Which leaves us with this final kind of lingering question. We're probably never going to know for sure if his death was an accident or if it was a choice. But his life and his work, they force us to ask ourselves, how does art help us survive the darkness? And what happens when, for some people, even that isn't enough?